Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're going to get started here in about 30 seconds. Lovely to see you all. Some friends, some fellow travelers, some new faces. Lovely. Ziva, shall we start?
Let's.
Let's do it. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ariel Mays. I'm the senior scholar in residence here at the Institute for Jewish Spirituality and Society. Our aim here at the Institute is to advance scholarship and social transformation by bringing Jewish spiritual knowledge to bear on the toughest challenges of contemporary society. Today, this morning, we are gathered together as a part of our Farbrengen series. It's a space to gather, to reflect, and to think as a community about some of these great questions. We're really excited this morning to have Ziva Hassenfeld with us. Ziva is the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Assistant Professor of Jewish Education, at least that's what the website says, at Brandeis University, and she's also the Assistant Director of Research at the Mandel Center. She studies reading comprehension from a sociocultural perspective, focusing on how children develop interpretations of the Hebrew Bible as a case of student reading development. She uses a variety of qualitative methods, including ethnographic observation, stimulated recall interviewing, and think aloud interviewing. These investigations connect her to the worlds of biblical hermeneutics, both contemporary and rabbinic, as well as literary theory and criticism. And today she's going to talk to us a little bit about her work and about the nexus of how these questions interface with modern Jewish mysticism. And I should note that in addition to her research, Ziva is a passionate and well-regarded educator who has taught in a million different places in a million different formats. You might hear my kids in the background. Definitely, they were also so excited to hear Ziva that they all stayed home from school today. Also, parent-teacher conferences. So if you hear a little background noise, please bear with me. Ziva, without further ado, I'm going to say thank you so much for being here, and we really look forward to learning from you.
Fabulous. I am absolutely delighted to be here to see some of my new friends from IJSS. I hope that as I present some ideas, you'll see the influence, the profound influence that our gathering just a few weeks ago had on me and my thinking. And I'm grateful to the entire IJSS community for coming into the questions that I'm asking in my research and both listening as I present and also hopefully sharing some of your thoughts and ideas. A lot of the work that I'm doing is influenced by work that Ariel has done, and all of this thinking actually began back at Stanford when I was doing my doctorate in the Graduate School of Education. So I'm delighted to pull it all together. The problem, the sort of the crisis of the moment that I would like to deal with today, and bring us inside some Jewish sources to think through, is a crisis that is both a crisis of the moment, but has actually been a perpetual crisis of the moment since sort of the 1950s famous Why Johnny Can't Read came out. And this is the question of American children learning to read and why that is so difficult. And scholars often refer to this as the reading wars and talk about the pendulum swing. We move back and forth in curriculum and pedagogy in the way that we wish to teach reading to children. There was a moment where, in the late 60s, where we felt, I think that reading and writing is actually quite natural and perhaps merely through exposure, culture, and the power of role models, children will naturally develop the capacity to read. This was sort of characterized by the work of Frank Smith and this idea that we really need not do much more than just simply allow them to read. Since then, the pendulum has swung intensely to the other side, which is the moment that we're going to enter today. And this came to be through a movement that maybe you're familiar with through your own children, through your own teaching, through your grandchildren, which is called the science of reading. And I would say that the science of reading basically has a monopoly right now on all educational policy across the country, even in sort of the more progressive states like Massachusetts. We just passed laws that not only require the screening that comes out of the science of reading. This is the idea that all children need to be screened very early for any sort of possible learning disability that could impair their capacity to learn how to read, and also that there's really only one way to teach reading, which is through phonics. And so right now, as of about a week ago in Massachusetts, every single district, and this is happening across the country, will choose between mandated curricula for teaching reading. So what's the problem with this? And where does Torah come in? Um, on the one hand, I want to say there's no problem with it. If you want to get into the weeds and we were really in the world of Jewish education, there are a few problems, which is namely that Jewish day schools don't have enough instructional hours to implement any of the mandated curricula, which just creates an interesting tension. But that's not the direction I want to go today. The direction I want to go today is to think about how do we, when we want to make a difference in the world, when we want to create sort of this storm of change, what rhetorically, how do we do that? And the way that we do that is that we tell stories. Stories are sort of the currency of change, the currency of identity, the currency of inspiration, motivation, and that's no different in sort of academic research as it is in any other social movement. In other words, if I have a policy change that I want to ensure gets taken up, I need to tell a pretty deep and comprehensive story to inspire that change. And so as we see these educational reforms sweeping the nation, what I am interested in drawing our attention to is the deep story that they're embedded in. And if there's nothing else that we take from today, it's the idea that the stories we tell matter. And anytime that we find ourselves operating only within one story, without any sort of contradicting stories, stories that put attention on how things can be, I'm going to put myself out there and say that that's probably going to restrict the way that we can think and create and be creative. Um, and so the I want to be 100% clear on this because no one should cite Professor Hassenfeld from Brandeis University saying that she's against science of reading. That'd be terrible for the children, terrible for me, and not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that as we are making these sweeping educational reforms, we need to be aware of the story that they're embedded in. And this story pushes up against another story that we find in Judaism and in particular mystical accounts of language and texts. So I want to spend 2 minutes on the story that the science of reading and phonics is embedded in. And then I think for the audience, it'll become clear where the tensions lie, but I will hold everyone's hand metaphorically and walk us through where the tensions lie and why it feels important to me to tell an alternative story, to sort of move around the country talking to teachers and saying, even as you are moving towards phonics instruction, and by the way, it's not just in English. If you look at Madik, which is out of Yeshiva University, which is really the only right now program we have for consistent evaluation of Hebrew reading, it is based off of everything that is coming out of the science of reading. Professor Scott Goldberg says that proudly and explicitly. And so as all of this is happening, it's important to sort of step back and name the tensions. And that's what we're going to do today. So the science of reading is embedded in a deep story. And this deep story is told by three of the most famous scholars, Marianne Wolf, Emerita, who was at Tufts. This was one of the most well sold books in on the New York Times list for years. This is the Haynes book, Reading in the Brain. And then this third book, which got taken up quite dramatically in a series of podcasts by Emily Hanford, who is a Brookline alum like myself. That's a town in Massachusetts. And this is Mark Seidenberg's book. And these three books tell a very, very clear story about language. And the story goes like this on one foot. Humans were never meant to read. Language and oral speech is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years old. And writing was this sort of um, almost like bizarre and happened upon excitement that developed to move speech. Sometimes I'm here and you're there and we don't have Zoom. And so if I need to communicate with you, maybe I could encode speech in writing and get it to you. And they tell this story through genetics, through history, um, through their newest sort of excitement, which is brain science and fMRIs and watching what happens in the brain when a child is reading. And the story is quite stark. I want to read you a few quotes, which go like this. Um, Again, I'm only quoting from these three books, and you'll see what they tell, and you'll begin to see the tensions that emerge. The science of reading has hitched its wagon to a story of reading focused on genetics, the brain, and categories like natural and unnatural. My argument is that all of these serve as too large and unnecessary legitimation for particular instructional strategies and priorities. What they tell is a story like this, that the invention of writing began from the discovery that, quote, and here I'm quoting from Seidenberg, visual systems could be recycled to code speech. Seidenberg calls writing the first information technology, and he makes a joke that we could imagine an application to an ancient patent office seeking a patent for, quote, a system for inscribing messages on semi-permanent media. Likewise, Marianne Wolf writes, there was a profound insight at some point in history that speech can be analyzed as a series of sounds, and any series of sounds can be represented with a relatively small group of visual symbols. Astonishingly, she writes, symbols rapidly became less pictographic and more logographic and abstract. This insight, what we call today the letter-sound correspondence, made writing possible. Writing doesn't represent the world, it only represents speech. And so the story goes on. And so what we get is we get basically a generation of elementary school educators and early child educators who are being told the following. There is no part of the brain that knows how to decode. There is nothing less natural than reading and writing. Therefore, you have a very small window of time to rewire children's brains to trick. They use the language of trick to trick the children's brains and use what were evolutionarily meant for visual circuits to teach children how to decode written text. Again, if there's only one message that I want anyone to take away from today, it's that the stories we tell matter. If you want to walk through life with a lachrymose narrative of Jewish history, that is going to determine your Jewish identity. Whereas if you want to walk through life with a more asset-based, text-based, literacy practice-based view of Jewish life, that's also going to determine the Jewish identity that you embody. It's the stories we tell matter. Now, for anyone on the call, and I'm going to open it up and we'll discuss all this together. I hope that you can sort of begin to predict how a different story is told in Jewish texts. And that's where I want to turn right now. Okay? So if the science of reading tells a story where nothing less natural has ever existed than writing and reading, we encounter a very, very different story when we turn to Jewish sources. And to frame that story, and I'm going to ask you to look at the source sheet in a moment, to frame that story, I want to just remind us that already in the Torah itself, when we're hearing about Matan Torah, when we're hearing about the giving of the Torah, we already have this concept of writing. At the beginning of chapter 34 of Lamed Dalet, it says, "Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Pesel lecha shnei luchot avanim kerishonim." This is after the first have been destroyed. "Vekatavti al haluchot et devarim asher hayu al haluchot harishonim asher shibarta." Right? So once again, God is giving the Ten Commandments, the Ten Dibrot, and it's very clear that they're going to be inscribed on tablets. That the act of writing is so important that even after Moshe broke them, we're going to do it again. But the idea of the significance of writing in Jewish tradition, and again, I want to be really clear that I'm indebted a lot to the work of Ariel Mays. This was something that I always sort of had a sense of. His work on the Maggid really helped me sharpen it. It goes back much farther and is a much deeper idea than simply that Torah was always both oral and written. And it actually goes back to if we go to the Zohar, we go to Sefer HaYetzirah, it goes back to the very concept of why the world was created. And I'm going to take us into those sources in a second, but I want to say why it matters because I'm going very fast. And I think it's important to say why it matters. And then we'll do the sources. Alongside this absolutely sweeping set of legislative changes, and I'm talking sweeping, I'm talking that you can go to districts and you can see videos. You can go on YouTube. I don't know why you have to go to the district. Go on YouTube and you can see entire elementary schools literally taking carts of books and throwing them away because they were the wrong way to teach reading and replacing them with new books. Alongside this sweeping change, which has a lot of evidence that it has actually increased students' capacity to decode and read. And in that way, that's why nobody should ever quote me as saying that I have any problem with the instructional strategies of science of reading. But alongside that, and I've sort of been predicting this as just one of those annoying editorial writers to the Boston Globe since they've been covering this. Alongside that, you have this other new crisis of reading, which is that nobody likes to read anymore. And these articles are showing up. This is Joshua Rothman in the New Yorker who's talking about with the advent of AI, why even teach reading in college courses? This is about new studies that are coming out from University of Florida that show kids don't read for pleasure. Now, everyone is happy to find multiple culprits, right? This is because of social media. This is because of shorter attention spans. But I've been saying from the beginning, this is because when you teach reading as nothing more than a technology for encoding speech, you forget what the actual purpose of reading could be, what the inspiring experience of reading could be, what Robert Alter calls the pleasure of reading. And so to get back to that alternative story, I want to look at what we find in Jewish sources. Now let's turn to the source sheet. And I'm actually going to, does everyone have the source sheet? Is everyone able to see the source sheet? Phenomenal. So I want to skip source one for now. And I want to move to source two. And source two takes us to Pirkei Avot. And this is something that the Maggid will reinterpret in a moment, but I want to actually just look at it on its own terms. Pirkei Avot is traditionally read between Pesach and Shavuot, and it has lots of sort of nice idioms about how to conduct ourselves in the world, how to conduct ourselves as people, as neighbors, as Jews, as readers. And this particular Mishnah tells us about Torah Lishma. I'm not going to translate Torah Lishma because everybody sort of has it's a contested term, and I think that the most helpful way to read Torah Lishma here is to understand it as some sort of way of approaching Torah that has positive valence. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kol ha'osek b'Torah lishma zocheh ledvarim harbeh. Rabbi Meir said that everyone who is able to engage in Torah lishma will merit dvarim harbeh. And I want us to sort of focus on that clause and think about what that may mean. Okay? V'lo od ela shekol ha'olam kulo kadei hulo nikra reya ahuv ohev et hamakom ohev et habriot mesamech et hamakom mesamech et habriot. And the list goes on and on about all of the things that you might merit if you successfully engage in Torah Lishma and some sort of approach or engagement with Torah that has this positive valence. Traditionally, maybe we could think of, but it's too simplistic, Torah Lishma as learning for its own sake. I don't exactly know what that even means. But take all the associations that you have with Torah Lishma and bring them into this Mishnah. And I was told not to be interactive until I'm done, but I have to actually ask this question. What's the tension in this Mishnah? Rabbi Meir Omer Kol ha'osek b'Torah lishma. Everyone who engages in Torah lishma in this positive way of learning for its own sake, of learning because you just love Torah, because you want to be in relationship with Torah, you want to be in relationship with God. Zocheh l'dvarim harbeh. Merits many things. And then 12 things are listed. What's the tension? I know you all have the answer, so I'm not going to do too much wait time because I feel very possessive of the time that I have with you guys. The tension is if Torah Lishma is this positive way of engaging with Torah that has no sort of other purpose except for love of Torah, love of God and your relationship with the divine. What's the Mishnah going on to state 12 positive uh, consequences of such behavior? If I say to my kids, anybody who just cleans up, who just picks up their socks out of love and respect of this family and of their parents, kivud ava'im, anyone who just does it out of pure lishma commitment to this family will get $10 of allowance. Once that's in writing, once that's been said, it would be very hard to claim pure motives on behalf of the children, right? Once and now I'm reading it in a particular way because I want to set up the Magi, but once we start to read it this way, and in the pushback that you could give me if I gave you a chance to push back at this point in the shir is you could say, well, Ziva, these aren't like really concrete, right? There are 12 things that are listed, but it's almost like the way that you'll be regarded in the world. It's not, a shidduch. It's not that you'll find someone to marry. It's not parnasa. It's not that you'll get money, right? It's not like material concrete things. It's just saying that this is the ways that you'll be improved. So that's sort of if you want to mitigate my reading, if you want to read against me, you could argue that, and I would say good point, good point. And certainly Zochel Dvarim Harbeh is a little bit out of sync with the rest of Pirkei Avot in the sense that there's multiple times where Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot will say 3 things, 5 things, 12 things, and only one other time that it says many things. But still, even acknowledging that yes, these aren't the most material, concrete list of things, there's still 12 pretty awesome things listed. I want to be considered uh, a great Jew, a great worshiper of God, a great neighbor. I want to be distanced from sin, right? These are all things that to me feel worth it. And so we walk away from this Mishnah with the question, why do it? Why list? Why list benefits to something that is supposed to be motivated by pure love of the activity? And if we accept that sort of that question on the Mishnah, then all of a sudden the Magi comes and says something quite beautiful. And here I'm in source 3. And Magid says like this: Kol ha'asek b'Torah lishma zocheh leharbe dvarim, zocheh leharbe dvarim, ratzon lomar kamo sheTorah hi ein sof shekdusha b'richu v'oraita had hu ken zocheh leharbe dvarim la'amekot haTorah tamid bli hefsek kema'ayan hanovea. Here, everyone who learns Torah Lishma merits not many things, but the alternative meaning of Devarim, many words, which is to say, the Torah is without end, which is to say, so is the Holy One. Anyone who studies will merit many words, the depths of Torah, without end, flowing forth like a constant spring. In other words, the Magid here, and again, I don't want to read intention into the Magid, but more I want to tell you how I'm reading the Magid. The Magid seems to, I see in what the Magid writes here, the same question I have. And something about the Mishnah doesn't sit right, that we don't actually want there to be a material reward for Torah Lishma. And so the Magid reinterprets the Mishnah to mean, the greatest gift that you can get from reading? More reading, more interpretation, more ideas. You know what the greatest gift of interpretation is? Creating more signs in the world. Every time your child looks at a cloud and says, hey, that kind of looks like an elephant. According to Magid, read through Ziva Hassenfeld, that's what this world is about. That is our purpose on earth. That is our meaning in this lifetime, which is to say this world is meant to be read and interpreted, and new meanings should be developed every single day. What kind of deep story is this a part of? This is a deep story which you can find for sure in Sefer Yetzirah, for sure in Zohar, for sure in the Magid, for sure in other Hasidic sources. It's also a deep story that you can find in Borges. It's also a deep story that you can find in Toni Morrison. And it's a deep story that pushes directly against the deep story of the science of reading, which is no, writing and reading are not fluke human inventions, completely unnatural. Writing and reading are the whole purpose of this endeavor called life. Writing and reading are the gift that the divine gave us. Writing and reading are the purpose of the creation of the world. And you see this, I'm running out of time and I didn't do a big source sheet, so just email me if you want these sources. Some of them I have more sources now in my collection after our conference, but this is a worldview in which the entire creation of the world was so that questions would be asked, meaning making would happen, interpretation would happen. Um, Print literacy, learning how to decode words on a page, is one form of reading, but it's just one form of reading in a multimodal world where the reader is the reader from day one. I want to tell one story and then end with the final source and open it up for questions. The story I want to tell goes like this. Someone asked, how's Boston? Boston's cold. But on our walk to synagogue, to shul every week, we walk along this wide path that cars are not allowed on, called the carriage lane, where the Boston Marathon happens every year. And as it gets warmer and warmer and closer to the marathon, your walk to shul is just inundated with runners and really good runners, really talented runners. And so we enjoy sort of commenting and admiring the human capacity to run uh, around the spring when our walk to shul overlaps with all of these runners training. And one day we're walking to shul last spring, and my 5-year-old son notices a man running with no shirt on, and he has tattooed a necklace with the crucifix. And he turns to us and he says, "Look, that man has the T necklace on. T for church." And his ever diligent older sister, my middle child, says, "Moshe, it's church, not church." And Moshe turns to her and goes, "Then what does the T stand for?" And she goes, I don't know. Good question. Now, this moment of interpretation and reading feels so perfect to me because, one, it's just delightful that Jewish kids in America can grow up until whatever age with absolutely no schema for for the crucifixion of Christ in their cultural knowledge. And second, Moshe is doing what in this alternative deep story of reading, this Jewish, this what I'm calling mystical deep story of reading, is our divine purpose. He is reading the world. He saw a sign, the crucifix. He decided it was a T. He knows that Jews don't wear it. He decided that it stands for church, which is where Christians go on Sundays. And to me, that is the right. We can fill in background knowledge. We can fill in schema, but we don't want to do ever in any educational program is to take away that interpretive impulse, which is the root of all religious life, all reading, all meaning making in this world. I'll end by saying this, and then I'll get off my soapbox and we can talk texts and we can talk Torah and we can talk science of reading. But it seems to me that if we raise a generation of teachers who are taught instructional strategies embedded in a deep story in which there is nothing less natural in the world than reading, and reading becomes so narrowly defined that there is no reading besides decoding print. And we are going to raise a generation of children who have zero appreciation for what to me is the most meaningful activity in the world, which is Torah, which is learning, which is meaning making. I'll end with this quote by Toni Morrison, which to me feels so aligned with the Maggid's reading of the Pirkei Avot. And she said this in her Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993, and she's telling this story, which is sort of a famous story that shows up in a variety of cultures, where there's a wise woman, an older wise blind woman who's considered sort of the source of wisdom to the community. And she lives a little far away, but people always go to her to ask her advice on anything. Should I have another child? Should I use this medicine? Should I use that? And the youth of the community say, "Who's she? She's old and she's blind. I'm going to show that she's not so great." And they go to her with a bird in their hand. And they say, "Is this bird alive or is it dead?" Thinking they're going to humiliate her. She's blind. She can't answer that. And she says, without missing a beat, "You know that I don't know if it's alive or dead because I'm blind. But I can tell you whether it's going to stay alive or become dead is in your hands." And in this speech, Morrison compares that to the use of language in our world right now and says, whether we use language as something that is alive or dead is up to us. Word work is sublime because it is generative. It makes meaning that secures our difference, our human difference, the way in which we're like no other life. We die, that may be the meaning of life, but we do language. that may be the measure of our life. Morrison, the Maggid, Torah has a different deep story about reading and a deep story that deserves as much attention as the one now being shared with all teachers everywhere in this country. Thank you guys so much for joining me.
Ziva, thank you. That was truly incredible. Speaking of Zoche Ledvarim Harbe, I am surrounded by little note cards of things that I want to follow up on or things that sparked my own imagination. I've got a couple of questions, but I imagine if I've got a couple, everyone else does as well. So I want to retreat into the background and see um, what are you all thinking? Where does this strike our community of learners and fellow travelers? What came up for you? Which questions might you have for Ziva?
Can I jump in with a question?
Please.
Um, Hi, Ziva. First of all, thanks so much. This is really interesting. Definitely the first thing that I thought about was Hakadosh Baruch Hu Istakel Ba'aresa U'Barei Alma, right? God looked into the Torah and created the world, implying that the written text is actually foundational to creation. Creation comes sort of like from written text as opposed to, you know, written text being some emergent accident. Um, the other thing that I was thinking about a lot is this. I don't know if it's like real or if it's like folklore, but this idea that all these great artists were dyslexic and they became artists because they were like Pablo Picasso couldn't read or whatever, right? And instead he found this alternative way of like he does a better job of expressing the concept of anguish than the letters ANGUISH does, right? With right? Like we can decode English, but like there's this almost like sort of like instant reading that happens by way of Guernica or whatever. Um, so yeah, this like really made me think a lot about that. But then I wonder, I like as a parent, if I were to parent a child who had dyslexia, I wonder about the story that I would want to tell, right? Do I want to tell them the story that their art is reading, or do I want to be able to frame it as, if we work on phonics really well, we can get to a better solution. And yeah, to what extent the element of like, oh, your painting is reading could be helpful in the narrative of my child.
Excellent. I love every sort of strand of thought that you shared. I'll quickly respond to a few of them. So yes, so the first one, so just for the sake of time, as I was sort of some things had to be cut. I realized that for this particular audience, probably you guys were holding in the Torah story of deep story of reading. And so these questions about, right, certainly we have sources where it seems like the written is primary. Sefer Yetzirah talks about sort of for the Tzimtzum to happen, that God had to carve space and that the space was carved in the shape of letters. So that's sort of on the one end of the spectrum, to that they're interchangeable and it's not so much about written or oral, but certainly the written is not a sort of unimaginable human discovery that was totally unnatural. And so yes, there are many sources, and I wish we had time to sort of look at some of them inside. To your question about multimodality and multiliteracy, I think that these three scholars were trying in the science of reading, not Emily Hanford. She was just cruel, okay? But these scholars, cruel in the sense that she did real damage and character assassination on well-meaning academics and scholars. That's why I call her cruel. But these scholars who were trying to put out popular books to get change to happen, yes, it's very hard to go through this country not being able to decode print literacy, and it's very powerful. And they talk about the Southern miracle, that really if you look at Louisiana, kids are decoding and reading at higher levels. And if you talk to kids who suffered from misdiagnosed or non-diagnosed dyslexia, that cause a lot of harm. The problem, the only thing that I'm saying is that if the pendulum swings all the way, there won't be any artists. There won't be any poets. Um, So where is the space? And the question starts in religious education. The question starts in Jewish schools. Where is the space for a different deep story? Not to replace the science of reading deep story, but to say there's other conceptions of the power of composition.
Yeah,
Can I add
Ellie.
something?
From Ellie to Ellie.
Okay. I just wanted to pick up on one thing that you mentioned almost in passing, um, and see if you could say more about it. And that is, you mentioned how in this story that is told, um, writing is invented as a way to kind of bridge a gap. When you want to speak to somebody who's not present, who's on the other side of the world, you can codify that speech in writing, and the writing allows you to transfer the word across distance. And the reason that struck me is because um, I was recently asked to speak at a panel on humanity and AI, and I was trying to think about language, especially large language models, and what is there something about different about human language? And I went to a Hasidic teaching from Rabbi Shnezalman of Liadi, um, about the creation of the first human beings. And what I drew out of that teaching is that what separates human language from the language of creation, as it were, from the language that is, as you say, in the narrative, in the Jewish narrative of creation, of being, language is kind of the script that underlies everything. But what distinguishes human language is the ability to communicate across gaps, across distance, to people who are different from yourself, also cosmically, to kind of communicate between higher realms and lower realms, um, to communicate between the inner language of the self, the subjective experience, and then transfer that to another person who is, in a way, infinitely removed from the self. So I wondered if you've thought about that gap and where that fits into your story, because you spoke about it in connection to the story that you're pushing against. But have you thought about that gap and the role it plays in the new story that you want to tell? New old story.
The new old story, I have more thinking to do, and you will hear from me because you're one of my new thought partners, having finished your book, your wonderful book,
Oh,
just the
thank you.
thought. And so as far as thinking about the new old story, I want to keep thinking about, but as far as what I'm pushing back against, I hope this can make sense. It makes sense in my head. I hope it'll make sense when it comes out. But I didn't start from a place of being interested in the deep stories. I started from a place of when I got to Stanford Graduate School and was working in the School of Education and working with some of the lead scholars in literacy and in comprehension, what we call sort of reading comprehension, that I kept seeing that they had no ability to sort of clarify what they meant by a right or wrong reading of a text. And I saw them circling. And so, for example, they say, well, that it was missing background knowledge. It was syntactically fair enough reading, but it was missing background knowledge. Or it's an off the wall reading because it's just not how we generally understand Pinocchio or whatever it is. And I could see that they really had no system to operationalize what was a good reading and what was a bad reading. And I kept sort of trying to bring Jewish literacy practices into the conversation and say, we have almost like a radically elastic conception of textual meaning. And if I bring you into really good Jewish elementary school classrooms, there are bad ones that are just doing transmission. But if I bring you into the really good ones where the teachers truly believe in Shivim Panim LaTorah, then what you'll see is an openness to student textual play that is unprecedented in any other context. And I was trying to make that case. And I think I did somewhat successfully and somewhat not successfully. And increasingly, in sort of the general discussion, people are interested when they ask for Jewish literacies. They want to know about the Jewish literacies of anti-Semitism. They're not really so much interested in our reading practices right now. But the way that I got to the deep story was to realize like, oh, if we don't sort of go further back and if we don't sort of deal with axioms and first principles and if I can't appreciate that you're coming from a place where speech is natural and is about communication and I say A and you receive A. Like that the world of literacy and the world of education is operating in a very concrete conception of communication. And it was only once I sort of began to see that this deep story was happening over and over again in the popular books that I realized, of course, I can't make the case about chidushim or elastic textual meaning, because I have to go even further back and I have to even deal with what you think the purpose of language is. The purpose of language in these books is about communicating needs. There's nothing. Now, they'll sort of at the end say, and everyone should read Proust and everyone should read Shakespeare. But they have no conceptual way to move why. What's the difference? How is language used there, given how you describe what language is? So I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but I think when you're having these conversations with broader audiences, it's very important to get them to narrate exactly what they think language is and what they think language can do in the world.
Yeah, thank you.
Ariel, we have some questions in the chat.
Feel free to pick them up. Yeah.
Okay, so Michael Wexler asked, only if others don't have questions, which I took the pause as an invitation for. As you were talking about words create reality, can you say a little about how words and stories create worldview, influence belief systems, and ultimately define one's cosmology or hypothesis about the universe? So I think that's like a very important question. I think it builds on Ellie's question. And I think the clearest way to explain it is, and again, this is of course coming from my discipline, which is education, but teacher beliefs matter. And when you go into a classroom, you can't, some of this stuff, in other words, teachers, before this whole science of reading, we put all our attention on decoding. When we're thinking about how we want to teach texts, there was a moment in education where it's important to allow students to have their own ideas about texts. But what that looks like in a classroom where the teacher's core worldview, core story about texts is that there is actually one correct meaning to the text. Perhaps that could be traced to authorial intent. What did the author mean in the story? What did the author want to say? Those classrooms always play out in a particular series of steps where ultimately the teacher can't help themselves because they feel they have a moral obligation. Those are great ideas, kids. Here's what the text means. When you go into a classroom where the teacher truly, in their own practice, in their own worldview, embodies this what Ellie called new old story about language and about text and about reading, you can see that the teacher is literally hanging on the words of the student. Because as I have in one of my articles, and I shared again recently, this was a West Coast teacher while I was doing my doctoral work at Stanford in a small Orthodox school near Stanford, which I'll say no more. And I did a think aloud interview with him, which is a really effective tool for educational research where you play back a clip from the classroom to the teacher and say, tell me, just don't analyze, don't evaluate yourself, just tell me as much as you can remember what you were thinking in that moment. And this teacher would say to me, I don't know all the Mefarshim, I don't know all the commentators, I don't have memorized every possible intended meaning of the Torah text. And so when a student speaks, I listen thinking this might be one of the intended meanings of this text that I don't yet have. So he's not listening for good pedagogy. He's listening from a worldview where there might be an intended divine meaning to this text that he doesn't know yet, and that the student is going to expose for him, reveal for him, whatever verb you want to use. And so I think these are stuff, I think ultimately which deep story you inhabit in your heart is going to inform not only the type of reader you are in the world, but the type of educator you are in the world, the type of parent you are in the world, the type of consumer of media you are in the world.
Ziva, I'm noticing also that Elaine has asked a question about if there are ways of fusing the ways of knowing and like where do we go from here and how do we move beyond this dilemma. I think you've diagnosed the problem in really incredible ways.
That's a wonderful question. If I am grateful for the question, and I think that it's a complicated question. I think it's about, again, I never think it's helpful to have a single deep story. I think we want to move between different deep stories, and in particular, deep stories that contradict. And one of the things that I noticed sort of moving between my community of rigorous social science researchers in the field of academic education and the teachers that I happen to study, which are often Torah teachers in elementary school, is they literally don't have curiosity about the other one's deep story. When I said to my advisor, who's now retired from Stanford, "Hey, I'm trying to write this up. I'm trying to tell an alternative story." He's a sweet guy, and he adores me and I adore his work, but he said, like, why? If you're operating in a religious system that thinks the world is 5,000 years old, why would we ever possibly listen to that? It literally has nothing to do with the scientific work that we're trying to do. And that was a really shocking moment for me because I realized there's a deep resistance to being open to inhabiting other deep stories. Maybe because it threatens the monopoly that a particular deep story can have on us. It threatens our certainty. But this is not a problem with any particular demographic in this country or world. It's a problem with all of us. And so it's not easy work, but I think it comes down to seeing teachers as humans, seeing teachers as not just a body in the classroom who's executing a curriculum, but a real person with real subjectivity that is worth our time and energy and resources to invest in how they see the world and their capacity to see the world in multiple ways. So
I'm
I guess
really
I would have Ariel do a PD for every teacher in this country on the
I'm really
navigating.
taken by no by this idea of multiple and conflicting deep stories that exist in a kind of creative conversation with one another. Of course, that's the world that we already live in. We're just not always frank about that. But what you said about a lack of curiosity, is a really interesting point about, I would say, not only the professionalization of various disciplines, education included, but also the academy itself, where curiosity seems to be an endangered species. So much of the academy is about becoming a master, and I use that word intentionally, of a particular domain of knowledge. And the idea of becoming a constant learner, I think, is much more rare. And I encounter many of these same questions now in my work with climate scientists, who either assume that religion is the problem or that it's utterly irrelevant to any of their contemporary questions. And that's also true of the humanities writ large, where the best case scenario, they think about the environmental humanities or the ecological humanities as science communication. How do we get people to care about science? And what they forget is that the humanities um, Jewish mysticism at, among them offer a different way of telling the story of who we are in the world, how we act in the world, how we make meaning of our world, and ultimately how we take care of that world. So what I'm hearing from you, if I've understood it correctly, is that there's uh, a deep story that has been told and may yet also still be told about the way that we think about education from the perspective of learners, from the perspective of educators, co-learners, facilitators, which doesn't supplant or replace the many advances that have been done in the, let's say, science of reading category, but also helps us heal some of the violence that has been done. As someone who grew up in the hooked on phonics generation and wasn't diagnosed with dyslexia until I got to college, talk about late breaking news. Um, uh, Other ways of thinking about our capacities as linguistic beings and meaning making beings, I think, have the capacity to do so much good in the world. And I guess the last thing to say is that it really dovetails with so much of Philip Wexler, the founder of the Institute's work on not alternatives to modernity, but a vision of modernity in which the so-called disenchantment hypothesis doesn't need to be the only story about what it means to exist in the world. That some measure of enchantment, of re-enchantment, which is not naive, but really entering into the world-building work of myth, is one of the great affordances of studying new ancient traditions. Um, Ziva, we've got to call it. I could talk to you for days and hours, and the rest, I think this community is such a special place. These Farbrengens are special not only because we have the most extraordinary educators, but we have the most extraordinary community of people who come as well. We'll have another on December 11th. Paul Nachme is going to come and talk about his work. Please join me in thanking Ziva Hassenfeld. I hope you're open to continuing the conversation by email, and I'm sure we're going to
Absolutely,
chat
please.
again. Um,
Thank
and
you all for being such wonderful thought partners in this work.
Thank you. That was really great.
so we'll be in touch, friends. Good to see you. Thank you, Ziva, and let's take good care. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.